Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. My name is Glenn Rawson. Welcome to my little studio. It is Sunday night, April the 12th, 2026, and this is our Fireside for this evening. And as you can tell, I'm back in the States again. We had 24 days traveling across Asia. How many thousands of miles, I have no idea. About 10 or so airplane flights, a couple of bullet train rides, a boat ride down the Mekong River, an incredible trip. Japan and Southeast Asia with Fun for Less tours. And it turns out that we're going again next year in early 2027. So if you'd like to experience Asia, come with me. You're more than welcome to come. You'd have to contact Fun for Less Tours and get on the list because it's going to sell out quickly. But again, that's Southeast Asia and Fun for Less Tours. Also, one other thing, hold on just a second. This book is doing incredibly well. The God of This Land, Stories of the American Founding. If you haven't yet received a copy, this is a great book of short stories to read to your children to instill in them a love of country and an understanding that this land was not founded just by men. It was also founded by God. That's what this book will help to teach. So it's available at glennrawsonstories.com. Okay? All right. Let's see. There are some other things coming up, which I will talk about in the break at the midpoint. All right? But for tonight, I would ask you to have a prayer in your heart as I go through 6 stories, 5 of which are brand new. This first one is a reminder. We just passed through the anniversary of the dedication of the Kirtland House of the Lord. This story pertains to that. It shouldn't be expected, however, that because we've done all the right things, that everything's going to go right for us all the time. Right? What matters is that we stay the course. And it isn't even so much how fast we move down that course towards celestial glory, as long as we're going in the right direction. The Kirtland Temple is a magnificent structure. It was designed by revelation and constructed by consecration, and miracles, it stands as a testament to the obedience and sacrifice of those early saints who built it. Foremost among those instrumental in the building of that temple was Artemis Millet. It's well known that Brigham Young was given a mission by the prophet Joseph Smith to travel to Canada, convert Artemis Millet, and invite him to come to Kirtland with $1,000 and build the Kirtland House of the Lord. Notwithstanding that he owned a large and prosperous construction business in Canada, Artemis accepted that invitation, if you can imagine, joined the church, moved to Kirtland. In 1834, he moved into a home just across Chillicothe Road from the temple site. He went back and forth during that season between Kirtland and Canada between 1833 and 1842. It is said that in the final stages of stuccoing the exterior walls of the temple, that Artemis received a revelation as to the process of making that stucco, and that secret, that recipe, remains a secret to this day. No one has ever been able to reproduce it. It was really good. At the completion of the Kirtland Temple, Artemis Millet and others who had assisted in the building of the house were called to a special meeting for the purpose of blessing in the name of the Lord those who have heretofore assisted in building by their labor and other means the house of the Lord. End quote. The prophet Joseph said that those who had distinguished themselves thus far by consecrating to the upbuilding of the house of the Lord, as well as laboring thereon, were to be remembered, that those who build it should own it and have the control of it. Well, sometime 1837, after the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society, Artemus took his family and left Kirtland. But like so many others, he didn't leave the church. He went back to Canada just as war broke out there, and because of his political affiliations, Artemus was on the wrong side. His property was confiscated. Then, sometime in 1840 or 1841, his second wife passed away, leaving him with 8 children to care for. Now, one son of Artemus recalled these difficult times. He said, "My father hired the children taken care of, and 6 boys boarded out until he could go to Ohio and get the means to take us there. But as soon as my father left, my mother's relatives had us all bound out." Now, bound out means that the boys became indentured servants, or slaves, if you will, for all intents and purposes. That is, until Artemus's oldest daughter, Emily, traveled up from Ohio to Ontario, where the children were at. She and her husband called all the children, dressed them in new clothes, and arranged for a grand party for all the children at a local hotel. Well, the children came for the party in the morning, and their masters were invited to come for dinner in the afternoon. However, when the masters showed up at 3, their dinner was there, but the children were gone. All of the children were on a boat, racing to the harbor across the lake at Kingston as fast as the 4-horse coach could travel, where they boarded a steamer and set out into Lake Erie, bound for Fairport Harbor in Ohio. They were running away. As the ship set sail less than a mile from shore, the cannon boomed, and the signal was given for the boat to turn around and go back. But the family of Artemus Millet went on, and they were reunited with their father once again. A great story. Artemus and his family joined with the saints at Nauvoo. When the church went west, Artemus went with them. He arrived in Salt Lake City in 1850, and he was asked by President Brigham Young to go to Manti. And there he continued his trade as a craftsman and a builder. He also served while there as a priesthood leader in the San Pete. He was called to Spring City, where he continued working, notwithstanding his age, to build. And finally, in his last years, Artemus Millet made his home where? Scipio, Utah, where he passed away in November 1874, true and faithful to the very end. Can it be said that this was a man who gave his life and his means from conversion to the grave in building up the kingdom of God on earth? Indeed, literally, Artemus Millet. Okay? All right, next story. I had the opportunity while on this tour to be associated with some wonderful people that I will always appreciate, always love. One of them was Helen. Please allow me to tell you about Helen. Now, that's not her birth name. That's her American name. She was born in 1959 in Vietnam. And I tell you her story that you might now look back at that very controversial war and maybe see it in a little bit different light. Helen's earliest memories were of living in a little grass hut with 7 siblings, while her single mother worked in Saigon to support them. At the age of 7, her mother remarried and the family moved to Saigon. The following are Helen's memories as a child in the war. She said, quote, "As a child, I learned to follow direction and be safe during the war. It was a normal part of life. I don't remember," she said, "living in fear, just cautious in all that we did. I remember watching B-52 bombers and bombs being dropped at a faraway distance, being instructed to dress in layers before going to bed at nights when sounds of gunshots were nearby. This is in case we needed to flee. Driving between towns, between my parents' homes in 3 different cities, was dangerous after sunset. There were fears of being ambushed by Viet Cong or roads being bombed. So those were the risks, she said, of traveling any distance. The most fearful memories, she continues, were during the Tet Offensive of 1968. During the Tet celebration, the surprised attacks were fierce. When we rushed back to our home in Saigon, she said, our home was filled with bullets. There were bullets and big rocket holes throughout the house. One of the rockets hit one of the bedrooms. Then, a most unexpected. In 1974, 4 experienced Latter-day Saint missionaries, acting with special permission, were sent into Vietnam to teach the gospel. Not long after, in the middle of the war, Helen's family was baptized into the church. Now, by that time, 1974, the United States had pulled out. The war was getting closer and closer to Saigon. Her father tried every means possible to get the family out of the country, but to no avail. But then, Helen shared this. Finally, one day, April the 20th, 1975, I was at church with some of my siblings. The branch president said we had a phone call from my mother. I remember being told I need to go home and someone will take us to the airport. My parents, she said, were already at the airport. We rode our bicycles and motorbikes home, said goodbye to my grandmother, not knowing ever see her again. We were rushed to the airport by someone. We were taken through a special entrance on the American side of the Tan Son Nhat Airport. The constant fear was to be separated from our parents in the chaos and panic-stricken crowds. While we were at the airport, it was announced that the president had left the country of South Vietnam. He resigned and left Vietnam on April 21st, 1975. A few days later, during one dark night, mind you, this is just days before the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese overtook Saigon and Saigon fell. This is just before. She said, during one dark night, our family were woken up and rushed quietly in the night. We were put on a bus in total darkness and were asked not to make a sound. The bus was driven in darkness until we got to a runway of some sort. We were asked to run on a plane in the dark. Run until you hit a wall, a net, and then sit quietly, she said. As we ran on to the C-130 planes, there were U.S. Army men lined on both sides of the plane for our safety. I found later that the U.S. Army was instructed to shoot any if necessary to protect these refugees and get them out. This, she said, was part of the Black Operation, an operation of evacuation without permission of the American ambassador. Well, the plane took off. Helen and her family made it out of South Vietnam. They were flown to the Philippines, then to Guam, and finally, eventually, to Camp Pendleton in California. Helen shared this powerful moment, riding a bus filled with other refugees on a freeway on a bright, sunny California day. She said, the most powerful, moving memory for me as a 15-year-old was the bus ride from the airport to the refugee camp at Pendleton. With wide, bright eyes, my nose was glued to the window of this peaceful, safe, beautiful land of America. I cannot believe my eyes of this new scene. Then she said, I saw cars below with strangers waving their hands and smiling at me. I felt this overwhelming sensation of their warm welcome through the glass windows of their cars. Their simple smiles and waves made me feel so welcomed. It left such an impression on me. End of quote. She shared another memory now in America. While at Camp Pendleton, President Spencer W. Kimball and his wife, Camilla, visited them. Helen said, quote, I vividly remember his counsel. Look forward, he said, and don't look back at what you lost. Learn the language and assimilate and see what America has to offer you. Work hard and don't depend on the government to take care of you, because in doing so, you will lose your freedom again. End of quote. Sister Camilla Kimball, she said, went on and shared her story of being a refugee in Mexico when she was a young girl. That, Helen said, encouraged me that I could do it too. All of that Helen shared with our group, and it all happened more than 50 years ago. Helen concluded with this touching tribute. I am forever grateful for the service of the U.S. soldiers. They fought and provided my country a chance to keep democracy. Even though they were not successful, they did all they could to save and evacuate as many as they could. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese were evacuated and have opportunities to progress and make a good life for ourselves. I am one of those lucky ones. My sincere thank you to anyone who served and fought in the war. Because of their service, my siblings, me, and my children and grandchildren have the lives we have today. My life today is the result of the dedicated and compassionate services of the men and women of the U.S. Army. End of quote. I can make you a promise. No matter what your political opinions and your view of the history of that war, you come with me to Vietnam, and your eyes will be opened, and you will, I promise, see it in a new light. Again, Christine and I are going back to Vietnam and Southeast Asia in the spring of 2027 with Fun for Less tours. If you'd like to come and see for yourself, give them a call. Next story. For this next story, I am indebted to the research of Keith J. Wilson and an article that he wrote called From Gutenberg to Grandin, Tracing the Development of the Printing Press. Here's the story. Palmyra, New York, began in the late 18th century as a single log cabin built by General John Swift on what would be later called Mud Creek. By 1796, that area called Swift's Landing was incorporated into a town and loftily renamed Palmyra. Well, it wasn't much of a town until about 1823 to 25. With the completion of the Erie Canal, Palmyra was instantly transformed from a tiny little frontier community into a bustling commercial hub. In 1824, during that boom, Egbert B. Grandin was 18 years old, and he was the youngest son of a local farmer. Well, as he turned 18, he signed on as an apprentice printer at the Wayne Sentinel, a newspaper there in Palmyra. By 1827, the 21-year-old Egbert Bratt Grandin, filled with ambition, purchased that newspaper and moved it up to a new and spacious location on Main Street. In 1829, he purchased a brand new state-of-the-art Smith press and had it shipped via the canal to Palmyra. Once there, that big heavy press was hoisted into place on the third floor of what is today the Grandin Building. As Wilson said it, quote, "Thus a daring 21-year-old with little more than a dream purchased a printing shop, moved the business and a costly press into a new and spacious location, and ventured heavily into the printing industry." Some would view these events as providential, others as mere historical coincidence. What is certain, he said, is that all of this occurred without Grandin's foreknowledge of the imminent printing of the Book of Mormon. End of quote. In other words, Grandin did all of this at great expense, not knowing what was coming or how he was going to pay for it. By late August 1829, a contract had been struck, and with no money forward, Grandin began the printing of the Book of Mormon. 5,000 leather-bound copies were to be completed in 7 months at a cost of $3,000. For the day and time and the place, that was a huge undertaking, a mammoth job, it was said. Now, according to accounts, the printing team worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 7 months. That would mean approximately 184 days to print the book, if everything went straight through, which of course it didn't. Wilson went on to explain. 16 pages were typeset and printed with each pull of the press lever. That meant for a 592-page book with a run of 5,000 copies, approximately 2,960,000 pages had to be printed. In layman's terms, the printing lever on this rugged Smith press would have been pulled at least 185,000 times during this 7-month period. It would have necessitated more than 1,000 pulls per day. But this is not all. To print each sheet of paper, 2 skilled pressmen had to quickly perform 9 other separate tasks. After the printing pull, these other 9 steps were as follows, and I quote, "Crank the bed back to its original position, lift up the frisket assembly, lift the frisket basket, remove the sheet, hand ink all 16 pages in the composite layout, lift the frisket back, register the sheet on the tin-pan bracket, lower the frisket bracket back into place, swing the frisket basket down on the inked layout, and crank the removable bed under the platen." Completing these tasks meant that one of the 185,000 pulls had been completed. 9 tasks, 1,000 times a day. On a daily basis, these tasks had to be repeated 1,000 times. However, this printing procedure constituted only a fraction of the effort to actually produce the book. The type and the spacers, which totaled over 42,500 individual pieces for each form, had to be typeset 37 different times. The total number of pieces set during the 7 months was more than 1.5 million. The entire manuscript also had to be punctuated by the typesetter. Let me diverge here for a minute. John H. Gilbert, was the typesetter and the punctuator. When he got the manuscript, there wasn't a period, a comma, or a paragraph throughout the entire manuscript. He did the whole thing. And as one who has studied 19th century writings and read letters and journals and manuscripts, how he figured out what that manuscript was supposed to say is nothing short of miraculous. Now back to the quote. Next, the printed sheets had to be hung and dried, after which the 37 signatures were folded, cut apart, and stitched together for each book. Finally, a binding was applied to the 592 pages. For a small frontier newspaper, this 185-day process was phenomenal. All of that is to say, at just the right time and in the most unlikely of places, the Book of Mormon came forth to the world, driven by the insatiable ambition of two very different men, Joseph Smith and Egbert Grandin. Again, Keith Wilson summarized the miracle this way, and I like this. Anciently, the Lord, through the prophet Isaiah, foretold the day when he would do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. End of quote, Isaiah 29. The often Latter-day Saint interpretation of this passage points to the Book of Mormon in its entirety, a marvelous manifestation in this last dispensation. But what if Isaiah was also foretelling the marvelous physical manner in which this marvelous work would be brought forth? To those who have come to believe the timely events from Gutenberg to Grandin that facilitated the printing of the Book of Mormon might be yet another evidence, he says, of God's hand in this marvelous work and a wonder. Something to think about. All right, let's take a break. How are you? I have not been able to be here for a while. I hope you are well. And if there are stories of miracles in your life or that of your ancestors, once again, I invite you to send them to me. Send them to Glenn at glennrawsonstories.com. I would be honored to share your stories, just like I did Helen just now. Also, may I tell you this? We have a tour coming up in May where we're going out on the trail for 4 days. Now, I don't know how to say this. That trail is very special. Yeah, it's a lot of dirt and a lot of sagebrush. And for the uninitiated, for those who don't appreciate it, it is absolutely boring out there. But when you come out there and see these sacred places like Devil's Gate, Martin's Cove, and Independence Rock, and so many other of these places where our Latter-day Saint pioneer history was so deeply involved, it changes the way you see a boring landscape. It no longer is boring. It becomes sacred. That trail is coming off. That tour on the trail is coming off in May. In addition, we're also doing the Temple and Tabernacles tour, a trip through the sacred of Utah from Logan all the way down to St. George, where we'll learn the story of these sacred temples. And then lastly, can I mention, coming up later this summer, I was just talking to Nate Harrington of Teton Stage Lines in Idaho yesterday, our cowboy, the Old West and Cowboy Tour, some new twists, some new wrinkles in the tour this year, a train ride, the old mining trains in South Dakota, as well as possibly Little Bighorn and other special sites. I can't wait for this tour. I've been doing a lot of research on the Code of the Cowboy and the work of and the Old West. So there's going to be some fun stuff on this tour. All three of these tours, you can get more information either by calling Dennis at 801-541-9760 or by going to tetonstagelines.com. Either way, I would love to see you out there. These tours aren't expensive, but they certainly are worth it. All right, next story. I used to have a professor when I was in school who would say, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, this is one of those. It was 4:45 in the morning, and about 80 of us were lined up and seated on a low stone wall running along the magnificent west side of the Angkor Wat Temple in Cambodia. I share with you now some of what I shared with my group that morning as we waited for the sun to rise over what is the largest religious monument in the world. There we were. Right in front of us was a moat, literally a moat, filled with water, nearly 600 feet across. Anciently, that moat of water represented the cosmic ocean. To cross over that body of water was to leave behind the ordinary world of mortals and commence a journey into the presence of God. Let me walk you through this sacred, ancient journey dating back to the 1100s of Angkor Wat Temple. Right next to us over here was the causeway by which you were to enter the sacred mountain of Angkor Wat, for so the complex was considered, the sacred mountain. That causeway represented, architecturally, a bridge between worlds. Interestingly, on both sides of the causeway, carved serpents lined both sides. They were at the very beginning of the journey to the sacred mountain, and they were considered guardians of the sacred space, the serpent. The ancient ones at Angkor Wat believed that the serpent was used by gods and demons in a tug of war to bring forth the world. As you walked across the causeway, you might notice that you began a gradual descent. And that gradual descent on the journey to God got steeper and more challenging as you went towards the center. After passing through the first gate, you would enter a large open area, and I mean it was big, open, grassy area that functioned as something of a place of, well, as something of a garden. It represented the earth after the initial creation, a place of peace and stillness. As you walked through that large open area, you walked past two sacred libraries, one on each side of the path. This great temple was considered a center of learning and spiritual knowledge. At that point in the journey, you are symbolically in what is considered the human world after creation. But the greater and more important journey is yet before you. As you ascended into the next court, the journey became more narrow and restricted. In these galleries, you would encounter magnificent, massive carvings on the walls. And what did these carvings do? Well, they were a visual panorama telling the story of the creation of the universe. One of them is called the story of the churning of the ocean of milk, and another of them tells the story of a war between two brothers, one good and one corrupt, that ultimately led to the downfall of the latter. And that war, as it's represented in the carving, was to restore balance and order in the universe. Here, it is said, You were symbolically stepping out of the world that you lived in and into the heart of the story that explained that world. You were walking through a history of the world. As you continued forward on your journey towards the center of the temple, you would encounter stairs, and they're not just stairs. They're imposing. They're steep. In order to progress, you have to move forward slowly, cautiously, with your body leaning forward just a bit, your concentration focused. At the top, you have now transitioned into another courtyard, higher and holier sphere. This space was considered so sacred, the public was not allowed to enter. It was restricted to royal officials, priests, and the king himself. This most inner space was a space of ritual and ceremony that further taught, purified, and prepared the individual to proceed into the very center, the presence of the divine. It's a space remarkably similar in function to the Holy of Holies in the ancient temple at Jerusalem. Once you were in this central area, the glorious central tower of Angkor Wat is before you, with an even more difficult staircase to climb. But once you did, and I mean it was way steep, no room for error. Once you made that climb to the very top of the center tower, you were now in the presence of divinity in deity himself. When the temple was first constructed nearly 1,000 years ago, the Hindu god Vishnu stood in statue at the very center. That temple was later taken over by the Buddhists, and today when you go in there, you will find a statue of the Buddha enshrined at the very core of that central tower of Angkor Wat. And now, according to their tradition, you have entered the holiest place, the center of the universe, Mount Meru, that point where heaven and earth meet and God's presence is found. You have come now to the end of your journey. You've come out of the world. You have the noise and chaos of the mortal world. You've left it, and you have now entered into a quiet realm of stillness and peace. You are now considered a new creature, having found peace and enlightenment. Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century by King Suryavarman II to the Hindu god Vishnu. It was designed and built to be a temple mountain, lying at the very heart and center of what could have been one of the largest pre-industrial cities on earth. A temple, a city with a temple at its center. Now, I could go on to say more, but I won't. All I can say is, those who have ears to hear what I just said will hear. Those who have eyes to see will see. Go. See it for yourself. All right, next story. One of those remarkable men of Company B of the Mormon Battalion that did so much for the city of San Diego was named Silas Harris. This is his story. Silas was born in 1824 in Lawrence County, Indiana, to Moses and Fanny Smith Harris. After a miraculous healing, Silas was baptized into the church near Far West, Missouri in 1838. He was 14. He was among those persecuted and driven out by the extermination order of the governor. His family went on with the church, finally settled in Montrose, Iowa, and built a new farm. In 1846, on the Missouri River, Silas enlisted in the Mormon Battalion, Company B, and notwithstanding that he contracted the mumps in the march, he went all the way through to San Diego. After discharge from the battalion in 1847, he returned to his family on the Missouri River. Now, they came across the plains, and on the way across the plains, he met and fell in love with Sariah Aldridge. September the 2nd, 1849, Silas married Sariah, where? Independence Rock, Wyoming. Quote, they had their wedding dance on the green grassy prairie by the light of the stars and the campfires and to the tune of the fiddle and accordion. End of quote. Well, from Independence Rock, Silas and Sariah went on to have 12 children and become of those quiet, stalwart saints who colonized these mountains, never recognized, hardly known except among their family, who laid the firm foundations of faith and community that still stand here today. God bless them. But I share Silas's story because of what his younger daughter wrote in summary of this good man's life. Would you listen to this? She said, one of the outstanding things I remember about my father is that I never saw him angry. He always said, problems must be met and difficulties settled with a clear mind. I never saw him, she continued, take a cup of tea or coffee or touch strong drink or taste tobacco. When asked if he would have a cup of tea, he would say, put in plenty of cream and sugar. Leave the tea out. He was a man of sound judgment, she said, kind and considerate, quiet and unassuming. I can see him now as he sat in council with his family. He would say, no, you are right, and then go ahead in spite of what people say. Also, he would say, drive your work. Never let your work drive you. My brothers, she said, were mostly sheep and cattlemen. He would say to them, no matter what you have, raise what you consume. He took great pride in raising good fruit. Our home was one big orchard. He would send to the Geneva nursery each year for choice fruits to take the place of the common ones. I remember so well his big sweet cherries beginning to bear. They were quite a rare article in Glendale, Nevada. The town boys enjoyed making raids on them. One particular night when they were going through the orchard, they had stopped at a pie cherry tree. My father came up to them unawares and said, boys, you haven't found the choice ones yet. He then led them to the big sweet cherries and told them to help themselves. One of those boys, who afterwards became Bishop of Glendale, said, we never bothered Uncle Silas's cherries again. He was always kind, she went on to say, to animals. J.B. Carpenter tells of the time when he was coming into town from his home about 3/4 of a mile above Glendale on his favorite horse. He was going at a lively speed. As he passed our home, Father raised his hand as a stop signal. As J.B. drew rein, Father walked out to the road, looked his horse over, praised him for his many fine qualities, admired the splendid riding outfit, and then, in his quiet, unassuming way, said, but did it ever occur to you, J.B., your horse is afoot? J.B. said it made such an impression upon him that he never forgot it. She went on to say, my father furnished employment for a great many people, either with his sheep or on the farm. If anyone came needing help, he always found something for them to do. Jim Smith tells of his experience with him as a boy. He said it was the first time he had ever worked for anyone. He went out to herd sheep, and like most boys, he overslept. When he finally woke up, the sheep had strayed far away. My father happened to come to camp just as he was getting up. When Father noticed Jim's embarrassment, he said, never mind, Jimmy. Nothing so bad, but it could be worse. They spent most of the day getting the sheep together again. Apostle Francis Lyman said of him after his death, "There was a man who was prepared to die, having lived a true life." End of quote. She concludes, father and mother had 91 grandchildren, and of their 11 children whom they reared to man and womanhood, all were sealed to their companions in the temple. End of quote. I share this question. You, me, how would you like to be remembered once you're gone? If we can answer that question, then you and I both know what we have to do. God bless you. Last story for tonight. When I was a student at BYU all those years ago, one of my favorite religion professors was Joseph Fielding McConkie. I knew when I went to his classes that I would be well fed. He loved the doctrine. Brother McConkie shared this following powerful story, later written into church curriculum. Quote, "Many years ago, in a small town in the southern part of the state of Utah, my great-grandmother was called to be the president of the Relief Society. During this period of our church's history, there existed a very bitter and antagonistic spirit between the Latter-day Saints and the Gentiles. In my great-grandmother's ward, one of the young sisters married a Gentile boy. This, of course, did not please either the saints or the Gentiles very much. In the course of time, this young couple gave birth to a child. Unfortunately, the mother became so ill in the process of childbirth that she was unable to care for her baby. Upon learning of this woman's condition, great-grandmother immediately went to the homes of the sisters in the ward and asked them if they would take a turn going into the home of this young couple to care for the baby. One by one, those women refused, and so the responsibility fell completely upon her. She would arise early in the morning and walk what was a considerable distance to the home of this young couple, where she would bathe and feed the baby, gather all that needed to be laundered and take it with her to her home, where she would then launder it and then return with it the next day. Great-grandmother, he said, had been doing this for some time, when one morning she felt too weak and too sick to go and perform the service that had become her custom. However, as she lay in bed, she realized that if she didn't go, the child would not be provided for. She mustered all her strength and went. After performing this service, she, and I suppose only with the help of the Lord, was able to return to her home, and upon entering her living room, collapsed into a large chair and immediately fell into a deep sleep. She said that as she slept, she felt as if she were consumed by a fire that would melt the very marrow of her bones. She began to dream, and dreamed that she was bathing the Christ child and glorying in what a privilege it would have been to have bathed the Son of God. Then the voice of the Lord spoke to her, saying, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, ye have done it unto me." End of quote. Who, my dear friends, in the name of the Lord, have you been called to serve? And that in spite of your own comfort and convenience. My friends, have a great week.